Right. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much, everyone who joined us today. This discussion is part of a new series that has been brought to you by Greenbox. I'll shortly speak. If you're not aware of what Greenbox is or what we work on, I'm going to briefly talk about that in a moment. But I'm Mohsen, and I'm the founder of Greenbox. And a lot of people I know in the room, and of course, will be listening in, but for a lot of people who are new to this organization, Greenbox was formed in 2017 as part of the Cambridge Social Ventures, and since then we have been really actively pursuing methods and experimentation approach through which we can support young people, not just in Pakistan but across the region and now globally. And I'll share my screen now. Right. So radical imaginations with myself, and today's topic, which is very near and dear to my heart, I'll speak about it shortly, is on the days of the future past or history of youth engagement in the country. But before that, what is Greenbox? Greenbox has emerged as a lab and experimentation space where we are trying to develop a transformative nature or a platform which would nurture environmental sustainability amongst young people and children in across the globe through shift in imaginations, policy and research, and action at the community or the local levels. So we're really trying to approach youth engagement from a holistic lens around multiple themes, particularly focusing on environmental sustainability. Now, what are radical imaginations, or why would we be pushing for such a thought on a Saturday afternoon? Idea of imagination is both evocative and elusive, and it allows you to look in the past, but also allows you to look in the future, right? Hence, imaginations allow us to project ourselves beyond a certain time or beyond a certain space and envision our individual and collective realities, right? So that is the kind of motivation for at least myself to have launched this discussion. Because, and why radical? Because radical would allow us to question things which might not think about or take for granted around ourselves. For instance, why are young people engaged the way they are? That's an important question that I was always intrigued to answer. But why did I choose to finally answer that? Some inspiration comes from the title X-Men Days of the Future Past, which I have conveniently copied for my presentation as well. The idea of being in the future and then being in the past at the same time, that was quite intriguing. But on a more theoretical level, it was actually this real life person who looks a bit like Professor Xavier is Michael Foucault, who's a French philosopher and is the basis of, provided a theoretical basis for a lot of my work during my PhD. And he says that you can only understand the relationship between different actors, be it state, be it people, be it non-state actors like organizations. You can only fully know it when you know the past, when you also know the history of how these relationships were constructed, right? You can't answer a question of how a certain subject, he calls, is formed unless we also look at the past realities. And for that, he says it's important to create a genealogy or history of or a historical account of any subject or any question that we are particularly looking at, and in this case, young people. Right. So before I go into Pakistan in particular, I tried in the past few years actually, when I was working on my PhD, to really think about how has youth engagement or how have we worked with young people across different decades or periods. Now, conveniently, the world, how it thinks in terms of, at least in Pakistan, we think in terms of pre-colonial times, colonial times when we were part of the British Raj, and then after post-independence, right? But if we don't go there just yet and look at what was happening globally. So I wanted to understand the global picture at first as well, right? So before uh, when the colonial period was on rise, really, and then we started to see that they were trying to expand multiple colonies across the world. We saw that there was a push for this evangelical Christianity, where you saw the religious push of conversion. So there were a lot of missionary schools that were brought in across the world, right? Similarly, there was this idea of discipline maketh man. So public school manliness was a great push. Similarly, fighting for the uh, queen or the king, or fighting for the imperialistic with an imperialistic spirit. So there was a push towards militarism and imperialism of the young people, and there was very less focus on community help, or as such, self-help, where yeah, people would be pushed to do it only for themselves. It was rather for the state or for the government, right? How useful you are for them. And that meant that there was the engagement of youth was mostly in terms of the militant or going to the service and stuff like that. And some of them was around them doing or mutual aid or philanthropy or helping in terms of disaster management and things like that. But then after the war, first war, there was this new push where a lot of people started to have anti-imperialism thoughts, or they wanted to, or some technical word is written here, Welsh internationalism, which just simply means that they wanted to not be engaged in anything to do with the war, and they wanted to think of not one being superior to the other, which led to more participation. There was more advocacy starting up, and a lot of young people started to play that role as well. And then we go to the Second World War. And after that, there was further push towards more, as we saw, a welfare state was pushed for to be developed, which meant that the people were the key here. They were the ones who could support each other when the state fails. And there were a lot of new development issues that were emerging. Technology was emerging, right? So, and similarly, this moved on in the decades from 70s onwards as well. And we saw this new rhetoric push towards sustainable development, which came in the popularized in the 1980s, then big society agenda popularized. And then in 1990, a new term came in Agenda 21, which was where for the first time, children and youth were accepted as a key working group for the United Nations, which meant all different states and non-state actors, for example, civil society organizations and NGOs, they all suddenly became really interested in the subject of youth engagement. So we saw a surge of bringing young people together, right? So this was just to set the scene globally as to how we have reached where we have reached in terms of youth engagement broadly. But now let's contextualize this in case of Pakistan. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware that before 1947, we were part of the British India colony, which meant that India, Bangladesh, present Bangladesh, and Pakistan were one colony, and we were administered by the British government at that time. Then in 1947, which marks the day today as well, on 14th August, we got independent. And then we were uh, conveniently divided into two countries, uh, country parts, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and in between was a stretch of India, which naturally really didn't work out. And because of XYZ reasons, there was a war in 1971, which led to the further partition of the country, which meant we lost East Pakistan, which basically now is Bangladesh, and we were left with West Pakistan only. So the idea here is that it has not been an easy journey for the country in the past 70 or so years, and that means that that had impact on the society or the public as well. And we shall see what those impacts were. But unfortunately, a lot of history, that is, there is not much history available on youth engagement. So it took me all different routes to find all this evidence. But whatever is available is mostly in the nature of written from the lens of the colonial writers or the British writers who thought we were practically less able or less capable to take care of our own things, which meant that they were the ones who really helped us become better. But that's not entirely true. And when you start to decolonize the history, you understand that our history of the region dates back to 5000 BC, one of the oldest and earliest sophisticated civilizations in the world. And there was a concept of class system. There was a concept of philanthropy, self-help, and civic engagement at that time in the Indus Valley civilization. And there is evidence for that, which really shows that the people of the region were willing to they did have that concept of citizenship from very early on. But unfortunately then, after the civilization crumbled and there were continuous foreign invasions in the region, which meant that the social fabric of the region started to tear apart. And we were mostly seen as slaves who could benefit the foreign invaders and their own different internal and external motivations, right? So that was the kind of period we saw. Before the British arrived, most of the young men, women were absolutely absent from any literature that we saw. We saw that most of the male youth were either entirely trained to become part of the military service for the empire, like Mughal Empire or the other empires that were active before the British arrived, or they would undertake part in agriculture work for livelihood purposes. So it was majorly either of the two, and most of it was either religious or cultural focus, right? So and mostly women were subjected to household chores, and illiteracy was rampant, and we saw that they were never a priority for the foreign invaders. And that's the preset before the British arrived. But when the British did arrive in the mid 17th century and they decided to stay like other rulers, we first saw that they tried to take full control of the subcontinent. And in doing so they really didn't care, and they really all they wanted was land. And we know the bloody history as how it went. But then came War of Independence in 1857, where they realized that young people were not passive recipients of the Western influence. And it really bothered the then government. And they wanted to then start a movement where they wanted to become the kind rulers or people who care about the public, right? And they started to develop infrastructure and administrative systems where they would engage, even so tokenistically, but they would engage with the local populace. In there's a very nice book, Juvenile Elation, which came out in 2014. Stephanie Olson is the author, and she writes that the moral concern emerged in the late 19th century after the War of Independence in amongst the British Empire for promoting the noble task of educating or telling young people or other people or the childish native of India. They really wanted to educate them or make them more civilized, if I may use the word. And youth were rather seen as malleable and impulsive, and they really needed disciplining. And if British were to stay for a very long time, they had to rein them, they had to discipline them. So the rhetoric was disciplining the youth, even in the colonial India. So we saw a lot of young initiatives started to come. One of the first youth focused organizations that ever surfaced in the colonial India was Young Men's Christian Association. And it came back in 1875, very near to when the War of Independence happened in 1857. And we saw that there was this push towards Christian orientation, and there was this these kind of organizations were also favored by the British, so they gave them space, they gave them encouragement. A lot of it was linked to missionary work. And then we also saw later on that Young Men's Hindu Association came up, Young Men's Buddhist Association came up, and you'll see a lot of Muslims were missing from this because they were blamed by the British majorly for causing the War of Independence, or what they call the Indian Mutiny of 1857. So Muslims were marginalized, or they were not really incorporated into these structures, which meant that there was no Young Men's Muslim Association as such. And this photograph you see here is from 1890, where the this was in Madras, where the Young Men's Christian Association was brought together for a training on developing a future leadership, youth leadership initiative. Right. So we saw a surge in such organizations coming up across the colonial India, but as you can see, there is no women representation here. Another example of really understanding how the British controlled the narrative of disciplining young people is uniform. Scouting or Girl Guides movements. So, boys and girls in uniform are an excellent example of understanding how this trend has really, and you can really see it in history because this is one of it was through an organization, so a lot of history is documented. Just before I go into the detail of how this panned out in India or Pakistan region now, most so scouting as an informal citizenship training concept emerged in actually in 1883. There was a boys brigade that was launched in Glasgow, which later formed the platform in 1907 for a guy called Robert Baden Ball, who came back from the war, and he said that, oh, I'm going to train young people on becoming better, or young men actually becoming better line of defense for the nation. And he started this experimental camp in 1907. So why was it done? He was afraid of for the future of the lazy and unhealthy young boys of the country. And that again went into the same rhetoric of disciplining. This photograph you see on the left side shows the then queen and one of the young boys, and how they were being promoted as the youngest line of defense for the empire. And this very similar thinking transferred into India as well, which I'll come to. But very interestingly, there are two photographs here which are very near and dear my heart because it took me everything to find them. The one in the middle is actually 1909, when so before 1909 there were no girls ever invited, and they were not ever even acknowledged as someone who could be the line of defense for the nation, or who could be part of the citizenship training. These girls you can see standing in the middle of the frame, they just turned up wearing hats and very similar uniform to the scouts, uninvited, when the king was speaking. And the king conveniently, I think it was King George, who conveniently ignored them and only acknowledged the young men in the ground. And he said that all the young men, they will become future of this country and the nation, and he just ignored the young women. That started a new movement where on the right you can see a, a form for joining scouts, where girls started to disguise as men to become part, or boys to become part of the scouts camps. And later we saw that they used to cut the names of the boys and write their real names when they would go home, and once they had filled the form and stuff. So there was this surge and need for girls to be acknowledged, to become part of this as well. And that led to Robert Paul's wife saying that, hey, I can also start something for the girls. And she started Girl Guides movement, right? So there were Boy Scouts and then there were Girl Guides. Now the time came for this to come to colonial India. This is almost time for First World War. Uh, British India is just starting to feel the resistance from the local public. There's this push towards anti-imperialism starting, and they want to control, and they want to discipline, and they want to, uh, use the influence to do so. And there comes this idea of scouting, which is so lucrative, right? So they bring that to India as well, and but initially they were very resistant. At least the guy who formed it, Robert, was resistant to bring this to British India because he thought that they weren't civilized enough to understand all the kind of training they wanted to do. But then in 1910, first scouting was brought actually not to the main India land, but in the Punjab province of now Pakistan, in Murray, in the northern hills of Murray, which is a small north town in the country, where in 1910 the first scouting headquarters was formed. And from there we saw that Boy Scout movement started. And in local India, they started calling them shikaris. Shikari means hunter in the local language, but in this case, it means native experts, which the British could use as uh, guides when hunting game, and they also provided great knowledge of the flora and fauna of the region. So young people were starting to be engaged in this boy shikari movement. Okay, and then we saw ultimately that in 1920s the colonial government spread out the Boy Scout movement across the country, and the viceroy of that time became the chief scout of India. It's a very similar principle which still follows, where the president of the country, like now in Pakistan, is the chief scout of Pakistan. So it's the same route which we saw was established back in the 1920s. And then what about the girls? Big problem. Girls were eventually brought in, but they didn't have as easy access as men. They were mostly seen, and this is actually in the papers and reports that have come out, that they were seen as exotic creatures who were then taken to jamborees or bigger girl guide events happening across the globe. And they were, especially if you can see, they are all wearing saris. Them in saris was seen as this exotic display, which then they were displayed at events across the world in jamborees, and that's how girls initially became part. And they were not trained to become the line of defense. They were trained on things like taking care of household chores, how to eat properly, how to eat with utensils popularized by Western culture, and so on and so forth. And this maternalism concept was pushed, that men need that militarism, but women needs maternalism, which is women's right ideology that would mean that they would not take interest in political activities and all, and they will really push that, as you know, caring duties and all in the subcontinent. This photograph you see is from 1920 from Girl Guides in Purulia in India, and this is one of the earliest Girl Guide clubs that was formed. Now, this stayed when the British even left. Our founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and his sister, Fatma Ali Jinnah, they actually, in 1947, attended a Boy Scouts event in France. And this was the year we became independent. So he really pushed for the importance of Scout movement. And he said that he would want to see this grow further. I can give you his exact quote. He said something like, Scouting can play a vital role in forming the character of a youth, promoting their physical, mental, and spiritual development, and marking them as well disciplined, useful, and good citizens. And we've actually had a few postal stamps celebrating. Uh, National postal stamps, like we celebrated the 25th Jubilee of the Scouts. We've had Girl Guides movement postal stamps as well. But unfortunately, the very traditional nature of the Scouts and Girl Guides organization or the associations in the country has really marred the role they have played till now. We still have a very active, by the time in 1947, we had 50,000 guides and scouts who came to Pakistan, but now we have up to 200,000 girl guides and scouts across the country, which in a way is part of this compulsory service program, if we may call it, in a lot of schools in across the country. Having said that, the true potential of these associations still remains very less explored, only because of the very colonial nature of the way organizations were put together, and the structure of the traditions remain very similar. This photograph you see on your left side uh, is colorized by of course, that time we didn't have those cameras, but the photograph shows Jinnah with students. Unfortunately, in our country, the word student and youth are used, interchangeably. In that, and students had played a very big role, as you saw previously. Like Muslim students were usually blamed for popularizing these anti-state agendas in the colonial India, in which they did. And then we saw surge of Muslim in League, All India Muslim League. Then we saw students taking up lead in really pushing for the agenda against the state, which meant that they were highly politicized, and students were part of this big resistance movements towards the British. But then comes 1947, and now the very charged, politicized youth are going to become part of your governance machinery of the country, which the state does not really like, right? They liked it until it was in their uh, ambit, but now that it is going to be slightly oppositional, they started to become more reluctant about it. Initially, not that much, but then comes 1970s, and we see that the then Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto himself, arising from student unions as a student leader, he became aversive to the idea of student unions and completely banned them in the country, which was a big hurdle for student politics, which also meant that now students on roads or in protests were criminalized, they went into jails, and then started this whole new era of apoliticizing or depoliticizing the young people. Hence, the political fabric of the country, or the democratic fabric, was somewhat torn apart because a lot of young people either were not engaged in the most meaningful way when it came to political advocacy and work, or B, they meant they were used by other stakeholders, anti-state stakeholders. For example, a lot of religious parties emerging at that time, or oppositional parties emerging at time, they then gave an impression to young people that your voices are not being heard, we need to do something about it. Some of them, especially the more rural youth voices, were covered by the madrasa, or the religious influence culture, and the more urban voices were covered by oppositional parties. So it was a mess. There were a lot of riots, there was a lot of fights, there was a lot of problems that emerged until the 1990s, really. So youth were considered problematic, unfortunately, by a lot of states. But then, that sorry, I missed a slide, but that also meant that this led to young people being seen as or being engaged in a tokenistic manner, which meant that most of the uh, 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 solutions that were created were not leading to any road, really. They were leading to nowhere. Why? Because they were barren agendas. Most of the governments, until recently, never actually created any program for young people in particular. But then we saw in the later 2015, very recently actually, or even before that, this popularized notion of demographic dividend. Pakistan is the sixth most populous country in the world, where 60% of your population is under the age of 30, which meant that, oh, youth are the lucrative uh, demographic group, not just from the political or democracy point of view, but also from the growth point of view. And then we saw other stakeholders like non-state actors like NGOs, civil society organizations, intergovernmental organizations like UN, World Bank, ADB, they all started to push for how this youth group or population group needs to be empowered. But but which also meant that empowered till when and to what extent, right? So there were contrasting agendas through which young people were starting to be engaged, mostly still political and coming from that state lens, that what is good for us and what we may ignore. And secondly, Pakistan's population bulge will start to shrinken. The youth bulge will start to shrinken by 2045, which means that we have only a few decades to fully leverage or meaningfully engage young people in doing so. Which then means that we can't only start engaging them in the softer targets or softer tasks which the state feels are safe. We also want, and we already see a lot of young people having that frustration in the state and the systems around them. But since a lot of their engagement still remains banned, especially in the political or dissentful form, there is this margin of still engaging them in a tokenistic margin. Only recently, the current government is very pro-youth, so they have started a Kamyab Jawan, or a successful young person program, which means that they're really, for the first time, a national youth development framework agenda has been put together, which also means that provincial youth policies are being further aligned to this national vision, and all these are being formed in partnership with the public sector and civil society organizations. But besides all this, the cardinal problem still remains the same. There are two problems. There's a bunch of young people who don't want to be engaged in a highly charged religious or political context because of all this history I shared with you right now. That's one chunk of the population. The other chunk, which is actually religiously influenced or politically influenced, is being used, is rather seen by the state as the enemy or someone that needs to be controlled, which means that there's this sense of conflict, and that can only be removed when the state fully acknowledges the problem and starts to unpack these problems. For example, in my PhD, I asked a very simple question: what is the relationship of religion and youth engagement? And unfortunately, the state thinks it's in unequivocal. It's basically positive. So if you are more religious, means you will be more active as a citizen, or you'll be more, influenced to do good. But it may not be true when you start to put in the political, cultural, and social dynamics in, right? So there, maybe someday I can talk about that in detail as well, and how for an Islamic republic where almost state policies always push for how religion could influence and how that could be used as a key trigger for engaging young people, it may remain problematic in the future. So I'll stop here. All I did today was give you a flavor of not just thinking in current sense, but also in past, and how we, especially for young women, we saw they opened up so many spaces for them, and they're so doing now as well. We could have gone in more detail about student movements and how young women in them also played a key role, but just to capture the essence here, we've had we've seen, as we saw from the global element, this push from anti-imperialism, then towards big society agenda, and now eventually towards this even capitalistic push towards or neoliberal push of becoming better citizens, not just for others but for themselves as well, or as they it contributes to their personal and professional growth. There is so much that one country as an example can show you, and a very similar pattern exists in India and even Bangladesh or the other South Asian countries who were part of the colony. And a similar effort needs to be done across the globe to try to really understand the historical roots of most of youth engagement activities across the globe. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. And if there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to take, and otherwise we'll close the call. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I have a question actually.
Go ahead,
So,
please.
hi, Hossein. So basically, while we're on the topic of youth engagement within the subcontinent and specifically Pakistan, like you mentioned, since 2015, we found out that 60% of Pakistan's population is under the age of 30, and the government is trying to make efforts to sort of, I mean, failed efforts in part, but sort of making efforts to engage the youth and everything. But do you also, but I mean, so sorry, basically, do you not think that the government is also then cracking down on voices on I would I'm trying to phrase it in a way that wouldn't incriminate me in a way, but basically on critical thinking, and also again like you mentioned, student unions were banned, and I'm from I'm from a university that sort of began talking about a student union, and we do sign those waivers as well, and there have been crackdowns against in inculcating that critical thinking and youth engagement and everything. So when you say youth engagement in Pakistan right now, do you mean youth engagement with the government or youth engagement between themselves? Because those are two separate things completely.
Right. So this one was majorly as a relationship with the state machinery or as from the governance point of view. But yes, it does also show that when I said that they were not passive recipients of the state's tools or state's mechanisms, that really shows that young people have their own agency and their own willingness to articulate into or convert it into potential or action on ground. I absolutely endorse your point, and I believe that the government at best is confused. Not just the government, almost all of us, when it comes to engaging young people. There are quite a few deterrents and factors here. One of them is this culture of young people as seen as less than being proper adults, right? So this rhetoric has to be changed. The second part of this is we are only comfortable for young people to be saying or doing stuff which goes with our own agenda or our own mandate, which is not true democracy, and which has impacts on how critical you want them to be, how useful you want them to be, and how adaptive as leaders you want to be, you want them to be on the grounds. And then why do you want them to be this? Why can't they be this all by themselves, right? So there is this contesting space that is there, and we all are really trying to navigate this with caution, only because we understand that there is a margin of conflict. And for a very long time, that is the reason youth space was closed and only recently starting to open. So people who work in the youth space are cautious of this, and they are trying to open it step by step. If we were to say things and do things in a much radical manner, there is an opportunity that we will go back to where we were, and which is unfortunate, but that is how we have to work around within the state machinery. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I don't know if this is off topic, but also speaking in terms of youth engagement, do you think that with the introduction of the single national curriculum, and then also you know, that that atmosphere of not letting adults think for themselves. Do you think Pakistan is sort of going backwards in terms of youth engagement?
It's more complicated than that. As I said, we are going up in some areas and we're going way down in other areas. And that will only be answered when we start to question and we start to unpack some of the problems and reasons. For example, uh, yes, we're going in this, we're going back in education, not in terms of literacy, we're going up there, but yes, in terms of how our curriculum is formed, what kind of skills they are trying to teach, and all is questionable. An effort we are doing at Greenbox, and we'll share something in few weeks, is we have written a critique of single national curriculum, at least from the lens of environmental education in the country and how still it's very traditional in nature and needs to open to the global or regional realities. So, as I said, all these efforts may not be ill aimed, or they may not be coming from a bad place. But yes, there is a margin for young people to be critical of them. And I would encourage all young people to, in your own agency and potential, you have the right to be critical. Of course, nobody's encouraging you to be dissentful or to do something against the state. But in your power and ambit as a good active citizen, you do have an opportunity to, in whatever space that is available to you, you make the most use of it and you use your voice for the concerns that are important to you. So I'll definitely encourage more and young people, and not just you, encourage your peers. A lot of people who can't listen to me because of language barrier, because of internet barrier, because of so many barriers around ourselves, those are the youth who are far more marginalized than any of us in the room or listening, right? So how do we open spaces for them before we even open more spaces for us, which may lead to closing spaces for all, if that makes sense, right? So we have to be taking a cautious path. But having said that, in all your own capacity, you have the margin to do radical imaginations and convert them into good action on the ground. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. I look forward to reading the critique
Great.
on the
Thank
single
you,
national
Faria.
curriculum.
If there are no other questions, thank you so much for everyone who joined in and listened. This topic is very near and dear my heart. I spent at least the last 4 or 5 years working on this, and I look forward to working on this further. I've done a very similar study in context of UK itself as well, so there's a good comparison that is available between global north and global south country context as well. And thank you so much. Another session of Radical Imaginations would be scheduled and shared on our social medias. And I would look forward to hearing from all of you on more topics of interest as well, which we can work around. Have a great weekend ahead and happy Independence Day, everyone. Thank you so much for listening in, and goodbye.